For years, most men have been searching for performance in all the wrong places, thinking it is about strength alone, or timing, or some secret trick hidden in physical ability. But what if the real shift begins quietly, long before anything even happens, in the way you prepare your body and mind when no one is watching, in the final hours of the night when everything slows down and your system is most receptive to restoration and connection? Imagine this for a moment, not as a trick but as a ritual, something so simple yet so overlooked that 99% of men never realize its impact. A nighttime oil routine that is not just about the body but about signaling safety, calm, confidence, and readiness to your own nervous system. Because true performance is never forced, it is allowed, it is built, and it is sustained through consistency and inner regulation. When a man begins to understand that his most powerful presence is not created in urgency but in relaxation, everything changes in how he approaches intimacy, connection, and his own sense of masculinity. And this is where the forgotten layer of male psychology comes into play. The layer where stress, overstimulation, and emotional neglect quietly erode confidence over time, not suddenly but gradually, until performance becomes something chased rather than something embodied. Now consider the nighttime hours, when the body is shifting from outward activity to inward repair, when hormones regulate, when the mind processes emotional residue from the day, and when the nervous system either resets or remains stuck in tension. This is where a simple oil ritual becomes more than skincare. It becomes a message to the body that it is safe, it is cared for, and it is allowed to release tension that has been stored unconsciously. Many men underestimate how much physical tension they carry in silence, not just in muscles but in posture, breathing, and even emotional expression. And this stored tension directly affects stamina, presence, and responsiveness in intimate situations. A nighttime oil routine, when done intentionally, helps bridge that gap between physical relaxation and emotional grounding, because touch, even self-applied, is one of the most powerful regulators of the human nervous system. When oil is applied slowly and mindfully, it increases circulation, softens tight areas, and most importantly, it creates a moment where the mind is forced to slow down and return to the body instead of racing through thoughts, worries, or performance anxiety. But the deeper secret here is not the oil itself. It is what it represents in the male psychological framework. Most men are conditioned to operate in performance mode, always doing, always proving, always pushing forward. But intimacy does not respond to pressure. It responds to presence. When a man begins a nightly ritual that involves calming touch and deliberate self-care, he is essentially retraining his nervous system to associate his body with comfort rather than stress. Over time, this shifts how he shows up in connection, because confidence is no longer something he tries to perform. It becomes something he naturally carries. This is why women often respond more deeply to presence than technique, because presence communicates safety. And safety is the foundation of emotional and physical attraction in long-term intimacy. The oils themselves, whether natural blends or simple carrier oils, are not magical substances, but they act as tools that enhance sensory awareness. The skin is the largest organ of the body and responds instantly to warmth, touch, and consistency. When a man introduces a nighttime oil ritual, especially after a warm shower or before sleep, he is amplifying sensory feedback loops that reconnect him to his body in a grounded way. This grounding effect is often overlooked in discussions about male performance. Yet it is one of the most critical elements, because disconnection from the body is one of the silent causes of inconsistency in confidence and intimacy. A man who is fully present in his body is naturally more attuned, more responsive, and more emotionally stable in intimate moments. There is also a deeper relational psychology at play. When a man takes care of himself in private, it subtly changes how he shows up in shared spaces. Self-care is not selfish in this context. It is stabilizing. It reduces dependency on external validation, because the nervous system begins to associate comfort with internal habits rather than external approval. This is important because performance anxiety in intimacy often comes from the fear of not being enough or not meeting expectations. But when the body is regularly soothed, tension decreases, and emotional regulation improves, making reactions more natural rather than forced. What makes this routine so overlooked is its simplicity. There is no dramatic transformation moment, no sudden switch, only repetition, consistency, and awareness. And yet, over time, the effects accumulate. Sleep improves because the nervous system is calmer. Confidence improves because the body feels more familiar and less tense. Emotional availability improves because stress is no longer carried into intimate moments. Even attraction dynamics can shift, not because anything artificial is being done, but because presence becomes more stable and grounded. In many ways, this is less about oil and more about identity. It is about becoming the kind of man who does not rush into intimacy with scattered energy, but arrives in it fully settled, fully aware, and fully connected to himself first. Because what most people never realize is that intimacy is not built in the moment it happens. It is built in the hours, days, and habits that lead up to it. And when a man begins to respect that rhythm, everything about his presence begins to change in a way that is felt more than it is explained. This is where the real foundation of the nighttime oil routine begins, not as a trick for performance, but as a recalibration of how a man relates to his own body, his own energy, and his own sense of calm before sleep. And once this foundation is understood, the next layer reveals even deeper connections between ritual, psychology, and emotional influence that most men never consciously access. As this practice deepens beyond the surface level, something more subtle begins to happen that most men do not immediately recognize because it does not announce itself with obvious change. It shows up quietly in how the body stops resisting rest and starts cooperating with recovery. When a nighttime oil routine becomes consistent, it stops being an activity and starts becoming a signal, a cue that tells the nervous system the day is over, the pressure is gone, and the body can finally downshift. This shift matters far more than it sounds, because modern male stress is not just mental, it is physiological. The body learns patterns, and when those patterns are dominated by tension, urgency, and stimulation, even moments meant for connection can carry traces of that internal speed. What this ritual does is slowly rewrite that baseline, not through force, but through repetition of calm, controlled touch that carries no expectation other than presence. There is a psychological layer here that is rarely discussed in the context of intimacy. Many men unknowingly associate their value with output, with performance, with doing something correctly in the moment. That conditioning creates invisible pressure, and pressure is one of the fastest ways to disconnect from natural responsiveness. When the mind is evaluating itself during intimate situations, the body cannot fully relax into instinct. But when a man regularly engages in a grounding nighttime ritual, especially one that involves slow, intentional self-contact like oil application, he begins to dismantle that internal monitoring system. He stops observing himself from the outside and starts inhabiting himself from within. That shift alone changes how presence is experienced in close emotional and physical moments, because it replaces self-judgment with embodied awareness. Over time, this also affects emotional memory. The nervous system does not only remember stress, it remembers relief. If the last consistent experience the body has before sleep is tension, scrolling, overstimulation, or unresolved thoughts, then that becomes the baseline state carried into the next day. But if the last consistent experience is calm touch, warmth, and deliberate slowing down, the body begins to associate nighttime with recovery rather than depletion. This is not abstract psychology. It is conditioning at a biological level. And when a man carries that calmer baseline into his daily interactions, including intimacy, he is no longer operating from a reactive state, but from a regulated one. What makes this especially powerful in the context of relationships is that presence is not something you can fake for long. People feel regulation. They feel when someone is grounded versus when someone is internally scattered. In intimate dynamics, this difference becomes even more noticeable because closeness amplifies emotional signals. A regulated nervous system communicates safety without words. It creates space where connection can deepen without pressure. And this is why something as simple as a nightly oil routine can indirectly influence relational harmony. It is not about the oil itself. It is about what the ritual trains inside the body over time. There is also an often ignored truth about male emotional processing. Many men do not have structured outlets for decompression, especially physical decompression that is not linked to competition, exercise intensity, or productivity goals. Without that decompression, stress accumulates silently. It shows up as irritability, fatigue, distraction, or emotional distance. A nighttime routine that includes slow, intentional touch introduces a form of nonverbal release. It gives the body permission to let go without needing language or analysis. This is important because not all tension is cognitive. Some of it lives in muscle memory, posture, and unconscious guarding. When oil is applied slowly, especially in a repetitive calming manner, it encourages that guarding to soften. As this continues over days and weeks, something interesting begins to emerge in how confidence is experienced. It becomes less dependent on external validation or momentary success, and more rooted in internal steadiness. This is the kind of confidence that does not fluctuate based on performance outcomes because it is not built on performance at all. It is built on regulation. And regulated men tend to show up differently in emotionally charged environments. They are less likely to rush, less likely to overthink, and more likely to stay grounded even when emotions are strong or unpredictable. In relationships, this creates a subtle but powerful shift. Intimacy is no longer approached as something to achieve but something to share. The urgency dissolves, replaced by attentiveness. And attentiveness is one of the most attractive psychological states in human connection because it communicates genuine engagement without pressure. A man who is fully present does not need to perform presence. It is already visible in his pace, his tone, his energy, and his ability to remain steady. Another overlooked aspect is how this routine affects sleep quality, which in turn directly affects hormonal balance, recovery, and emotional stability. When the body enters sleep in a relaxed state, the depth of recovery improves. That improved recovery impacts everything from energy levels to mood regulation to physical vitality. And when the body feels well rested and regulated, it naturally performs better in all domains, including intimacy. This is not because of any direct stimulation technique, but because the foundation of the system is functioning more efficiently. There is also a symbolic dimension to this ritual that many men subconsciously respond to once they begin it. It creates a boundary between the external world and the internal world. During the day, a man is often engaged in outward-facing demands, responsibilities, decisions, and reactions. At night, this ritual marks a return inward, a reclaiming of personal space and bodily awareness. That separation is crucial because without it, the nervous system remains partially on, even during rest. The oil routine becomes a psychological marker that says the external world can wait, and the internal system can now restore itself. What starts to happen over time is not dramatic in appearance, but profound in effect. The body feels less like a machine being pushed, and more like a system being supported. Emotional reactivity decreases, physical tension reduces, sleep deepens. And perhaps most importantly, presence becomes easier to access without effort. This ease is what often translates into stronger connection dynamics, because ease is felt more strongly than intensity in long-term intimacy. And yet, even with all of this unfolding, the most important realization is still forming underneath it all. This practice is not about becoming someone different. It is about removing the layers of tension that were never needed in the first place. It is about returning to a state where the body is not constantly bracing, the mind is not constantly evaluating, and the self is not constantly performing. In that return, something more natural emerges, something that feels stable, grounded, and quietly confident in a way that does not require explanation. And as this understanding deepens, the final layer of this routine reveals how it ties directly into identity, emotional connection, and the long-term shaping of how a man experiences both himself and intimacy itself in a sustained and meaningful way. As this practice matures into something consistent rather than experimental, the real transformation stops being about technique entirely and starts becoming about identity. Because at a certain point, a man no longer thinks of himself as someone doing a nighttime routine. He begins to experience himself as someone who naturally lives in a calmer state. That distinction is subtle but powerful. One is effort, the other is embodiment. And embodiment is where lasting change happens in both psychology and intimacy. What often goes unnoticed is how deeply identity shapes relational outcomes. If a man sees himself as tense, rushed, or inconsistent, he will unconsciously move through connection in ways that reflect that self-image. But when his daily and nightly patterns reinforce calmness, grounding, and bodily awareness, that identity begins to shift without force. He no longer has to remind himself to slow down or be present, because his baseline has changed. The nervous system starts to default to regulation rather than reactivity. And that default state is what others ultimately respond to in close connection, far more than any learned technique or temporary effort. In intimacy, this becomes especially important Because real connection is not built in isolated moments, it is built on continuity of energy. A man who enters intimate situations carrying fragmented attention will often feel the strain of trying to switch modes. But a man who has already been living in a regulated, grounded state through consistent nightly decompression does not need to switch anything. There is no internal transition from stress to presence, because presence has already been established long before the moment begins. That is where the quiet power of this practice reveals itself. It removes the gap between everyday life and intimate life, allowing the same steadiness to carry through both. There is also a deeper emotional intelligence that develops alongside this physical grounding. When the body is consistently soothed, the mind becomes less defensive. And when the mind becomes less defensive, it becomes more receptive. This receptivity is not about passivity, it is about awareness. A man becomes more attuned to subtle emotional cues, more aware of shifts in tone, energy, and response. This awareness allows for a more responsive form of connection rather than a reactive one. Instead of trying to control outcomes or anticipate performance expectations, he becomes present with what is actually unfolding in real time. This is where many misunderstand the nature of masculine strength and intimacy. It is not about intensity or dominance, but about stability. Stability creates space for depth. When a man is stable in his internal state, the other person does not feel the need to compensate for unpredictability. There is less emotional noise, less tension, and more room for authentic connection to develop naturally. And this stability is not built in the moment. It is built in repetition, especially in private moments, like the end of the day, when the nervous system is most receptive to conditioning. The nighttime oil routine, in this sense, becomes a form of silent training. Not training for performance, but training for presence. Every application of touch, every moment of slowing down, every intentional pause signals to the body that urgency is not required. Over time, this rewires the relationship between effort and relaxation. What once felt unfamiliar begins to feel normal. What once required attention begins to happen automatically. And when calmness becomes automatic, confidence stops feeling like something to prove and starts feeling like something to inhabit. There is also an important relational ripple effect that develops when a man consistently operates from this grounded state. Intimacy becomes less about expectation and more about experience. This shift changes everything in how connection is felt on both sides. Pressure tends to contract emotional openness, while safety expands it. When a man brings a regulated presence into intimacy, the emotional environment becomes more open, more patient, and more naturally responsive. This does not come from technique, but from internal state alignment. Another overlooked dimension is how this practice influences self-respect. Self-respect is not built only through achievement, but through the way a person treats themselves when no one is watching. A nighttime ritual that prioritizes calm, care, and bodily awareness sends a message internally that the body is worth attention, not just output. This quietly reinforces a healthier internal dialogue over time. Instead of relating to the body as something to push or fix, the relationship shifts towards something more respectful and cooperative. And that shift alone has long-term implications for confidence, emotional balance, and relational satisfaction. As this continues to integrate, something else becomes noticeable. The need for external reassurance begins to reduce. not because validation becomes irrelevant, but because internal stability becomes more reliable. A man who feels grounded in his own system is less dependent on external signals to confirm his adequacy. This reduces anxiety in intimate situations because the focus shifts away from self-evaluation and toward shared experience. And shared experience is where real connection thrives. In the long arc of this transformation, what began as a simple nighttime oil routine reveals itself as something far more foundational. It is not about enhancing performance in isolation, but about reshaping the internal environment from which performance naturally emerges. When the internal environment is calm, regulated, and present, external expression aligns without strain. There is no need to force presence, because presence is already there. There is no need to chase confidence, because confidence is already embodied. And there is no need to overthink connection, because connection flows more naturally from stability. Ultimately, the deeper truth is that intimacy is never just about action, it is about state. And state is built long before the moment begins. A man who understands this stops looking for shortcuts and starts building consistency in the unseen parts of his routine. He begins to realize that what happens in the quiet hours of the night often determines the quality of presence he brings into every meaningful interaction the next day. And so the real takeaway is not a technique or a trick, but a shift in understanding. When a man learns to regulate himself through simple, consistent practices like a nighttime oil routine, he is not just improving his performance, he is reshaping his entire internal baseline. And from that baseline, everything else becomes more natural, more stable, and more deeply connected in a way that lasts far beyond any single moment. This is where the full picture comes together, not as something added to masculinity, but as something that refines it into calm strength, grounded presence, and a quieter form of confidence that speaks most clearly in the moments where words are no longer needed.